There is a moment in the slaughter of a pig that most people in the modern world never witness and never think about. It is the moment when the blood leaves the body.
The journey
In an
from the line
industrial
to the plate is
slaughterhouse, this moment
meticulously
is
controlled,
managed,
ensuring
contained,
uniformity
processed,
across the
and
globe.
disposed of as efficiently as possible. It is a byproduct, a waste product, something to be handled and eliminated in the course of converting an animal into the clean, packaged, odorless protein that appears on supermarket shelves with no visible connection to the living thing it came from. In the farmyards and small holdings of northeastern Brazil, in the communities where the tradition this story is about was born and where it continues today, that moment is something entirely different. It is not waste. It is not a byproduct. It is the beginning of a dish. And the dish that begins in that moment, in the careful collection of the blood before it can be lost, in the immediate seasoning that prevents it from coagulating into something unusable, in the combination of that blood with the organs and fat that the industrial system also discards, is one of the most culturally significant and least understood foods in the entire culinary tradition of Brazil. The dish is called Sarapatel, and understanding what it is requires understanding where it came from, which requires going back much further than the northeastern farmyard and much further than the Portuguese colonial period that shaped the Northeast food culture in the ways that are most commonly discussed. The Sarapatel has roots that extend into three continents and several centuries of forced contact between people who had no choice about the contact and who found, in the kitchen, one of the few spaces where the terms of that contact could be partially negotiated on their own terms. The Portuguese brought to Brazil a culinary tradition that already included dishes made from the blood and organs of slaughtered animals. In Portugal, dishes combining pork blood with offal and fat were part of the food culture of rural communities where the annual pig slaughter was one of the most important events of the agricultural calendar. A moment of abundance in a life of careful management when the entire animal was converted into food in forms that could sustain a household through the months ahead. The sarabulho, as the Portuguese dish was called, was not a dish of poverty in the sense of desperation. It was a dish of complete utilization, of the knowledge that nothing from the slaughter should be wasted, that every part of the animal contained nutrition that could be preserved and consumed, and that the parts that spoiled most quickly, the blood, the organs, needed to be dealt with first and with the most skill. When the Portuguese arrived in Brazil and established the agricultural economy of the Northeast, the sugar plantations, the cattle ranches, the mixed farming communities of the interior, they brought this culinary tradition with them. But the people who did the cooking on those properties were not, in most cases, Portuguese. They were enslaved Africans brought from regions of West and Central Africa that had their own deep traditions around the use of blood and offal in cooking, their own knowledge of how to handle the parts of an animal that required the most skill and the most immediate attention after slaughter. The encounter between the Portuguese cerebral tradition and the African culinary knowledge of the people who were doing the actual cooking in the kitchens of the Northeast produced something new, something that was neither purely Portuguese nor purely African, but that carried elements of both, transformed by the specific ingredients available in northeastern Brazil and by the specific conditions under which the cooking was being done. Those conditions were not the conditions of a professional kitchen or even of a comfortable farmhouse kitchen. They were the conditions of the senzala, the slave quarters, where the people who cooked the food of the plantation received, as their own food, the parts of the slaughtered animals that the plantation owners did not want: the blood, the intestines, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the scraps of fat trimmed from the cuts that went to the main house. These were not ingredients chosen for their culinary potential. They were what was left after everything considered desirable had been taken. And the people who received them did what people do when they are given the worst of something and are hungry enough that it must become food. They applied everything they knew about flavor and technique and the specific chemistry of cooking difficult ingredients to make something that was not just edible but good. Something that was worth eating, not just because there was nothing else, but because the skill applied to it had produced genuine flavor, genuine nourishment, genuine satisfaction. The Sarapatel that emerged from this process is a dish that requires immediate action after slaughter because its primary ingredient, the blood, cannot wait. Fresh pork blood begins to coagulate within minutes of leaving the animal, and once coagulated, it becomes difficult to work with in the way the dish requires. The collection of the blood is therefore the first act of the Sarapatel preparation, and it is done with the specific knowledge that the collected blood needs to be treated immediately. Seasoned with salt and with the acidic elements, typically vinegar or the juice of the lime that grows abundantly across the Northeast, that slow the coagulation process and allow the blood to remain liquid long enough to be incorporated into the dish. This immediate
Gently
seasoning is
now.
not
Feel
just a
the
technical
resistance
step.
in the dough.
Like
It is the
this?
first
Yes, that is
expression
the
of the cook's
perfect
knowledge.
consistency.
The knowledge of what the blood needs in the first minutes after collection, knowledge that cannot be learned from a recipe, but only from having done it, from having watched someone else do it, from the accumulated practice of hands that have handled blood before and know what it requires. The organs are prepared alongside the blood, and their preparation requires a different set of knowledge. Knowledge of which organs need to be cleaned in specific ways before cooking, which need extended time over heat to become tender, which contribute flavor and which contribute texture, and how to balance the two in the final dish. The heart is dense and muscular and needs to be cut small and cooked long. The liver is intense in flavor and needs to be balanced against other ingredients so that it contributes depth without overwhelming everything else. The lungs are soft and absorb the cooking liquid readily, becoming carriers of the sauce rather than having strong flavor of their own.
Gently push it down with your
The
thumb.
intestines, used in some
See?
regional versions
Yes.
of the dish, require
Oh,
the most
that's much
extensive
better.
cleaning and the most specific handling, a process that is time consuming and that most contemporary cooks outside the tradition find difficult to approach without the guidance of someone who has done it before. The fat is rendered, cooked over heat until the solid fat tissue has given up its liquid fat, which becomes the cooking medium for everything else. This rendering step is one of the things that gives Sarapatel its specific character, because the fat of the pork, rendered in the pan before the other ingredients are added, produces a cooking environment that is intensely flavored from the beginning. Not neutral oil, not butter, but pork fat with all of its specific animal character, coating and penetrating the organs and blood as they cook, producing a final dish that is completely saturated with the flavor of the pig in a way that nothing cooked in a neutral medium could achieve. The combination of blood, organs, and rendered fat in the cooking pot produces, as it cooks together, a transformation that is one of the most alchemical things in Brazilian cooking. The blood, which begins as a dark liquid, thickens as it heats, its proteins denaturing and forming a dense, intensely flavored mass that binds the other ingredients together and coats every surface with a deep, dark, mineral richness. The organs, cooking in this environment, take on a flavor complexity that they would not have if cooked separately, each one contributing to the developing flavor of the dish while simultaneously absorbing the flavors of everything around it. The fat, rendered and distributed through everything, carries and amplifies the flavors rather than simply coating them. The result of this combination, cooked together for the extended period that the dish requires, typically hours rather than minutes, is something that does not resemble any of its individual components and that cannot be produced by any shortcut or substitution. It is a dish that is the sum of a specific set of ingredients handled in a specific way over a specific period of time, and any significant change to any of those elements produces a different dish. The seasoning of Sarapatel varies by region and by family, but certain elements are consistent across the tradition. The vinegar or acidic element that was added to the blood at collection continues to balance the dish as it cooks, cutting through the richness of the fat and the intensity of the blood. Onion and garlic are present in virtually every version. The dried herbs of the Northeast, the oregano, the bay leaf, the specific combination that varies by cook, and that is one of the ways that individual family traditions distinguish their Sarapatel from everyone else's, are added at specific points in the cooking process, their timing reflecting knowledge of when different aromatics contribute most effectively to the developing flavor. The hot pepper, in amounts that vary by regional preference, adds the heat that the dish needs to remain lively despite its richness. And the final seasoning, the adjustments made at the end of the cooking when the dish has been tasted by someone who knows what it should be and can identify what it still needs, reflects the most practiced and most personal element of the entire preparation. The Chouriço nordestino is a related preparation that takes the same primary ingredient, pork blood, and handles it differently, producing a result that is different in form but continuous in its cultural logic with the Sarapatel, where the Sarapatel is a wet dish, a stew, essentially with significant liquid produced by the combination of blood, organs, and cooking liquid. The chorizo is a solid preparation, the blood combined with fat and seasonings and filled into casings. Traditionally, the intestines of the pig, which in this application become not a secondary ingredient, but the container for the primary one. And then, cooked or smoked to a point where it holds its form and can be stored and sliced. The chorizo represents a preservation step applied to the same ingredients, a way of converting the blood and fat that must be dealt with immediately after slaughter into a product that can be kept for days or weeks rather than consumed on the day of the slaughter. The smoking of chorizo, where it is practiced, adds a preservation dimension that extends the shelf life further. The same logic of using available environmental conditions as preservation technology that underlies the carne de sol and the farinha traditions of the Sertão. The wood smoke that gives the chorizo its characteristic flavor is also inhibiting the microbial growth that would otherwise quickly spoil a product made from blood and organ meat. The flavor and the preservation are the same process, as they are in every traditional food preservation technology that preceded refrigeration. The cook who developed the smoking technique was not thinking about food science. They were thinking about how to keep the chorizo safe to eat for as long as possible, and they found that smoke accomplished that while also doing something interesting and desirable to the flavor. The understanding of why it worked came much later. The practical application of the fact that it worked was the knowledge that mattered. The geography of Sarapatel and chorizo within Brazil is not uniform. The strongest tradition of both dishes is in the Northeast. In Pernambuco, in the state where Recife sits at the center of a food culture that has maintained its connection to the pork-based traditions of the colonial period more continuously than most other regions of Brazil. In Pernambuco, the Sarapatel is not a marginal or unusual dish. It is a central one, present at major celebrations, at the festivals that mark the agricultural and religious calendar of the region, at the tables of families who have been making it for generations and who have strong opinions about the correct way to make it and the incorrect ways that other families practice. The dish has the social weight of something that has been around long enough to accumulate tradition, to develop regional variants, to become a site of cultural identity and pride rather than simply a practical solution to a culinary problem. In other parts of Brazil, the tradition is present but less central. In Minas Gerais, dishes made from pork blood and offal appear in the culinary tradition under different names and with somewhat different preparations. The influence of the Portuguese sarabulho more directly visible in some versions, the African element more prominent in others, the specific combination reflecting the particular history of the communities where each version developed. In the Amazon region, pork blood dishes are present in communities that have sufficient access to pig slaughter to maintain the tradition, though the isolation of many Amazonian communities means that the tradition there has developed in more specific and more locally particular ways than in the more connected communities of the Northeast. The movement of Sarapatel from the farmyard and the senzala to the restaurant is a story that mirrors the movement of many dishes that began in conditions of scarcity and ended up on menus where they are presented as expressions of culinary heritage. In the major cities of the Northeast, in Recife, in Fortaleza, in Salvador, Sarapatel appears in restaurants that range from the very simple to the relatively sophisticated, and its presence in both contexts reflects the dual status it has achieved in the contemporary food culture of the region. It is simultaneously the food of the interior of the small farm and the family pig slaughter, and the generations of cooks who maintained the tradition through conditions that had nothing to do with culinary fashion, and the food of a regional identity that urban Northeasterners claim with a pride that is also a claim about where they come from and what that means. The chefs who have engaged seriously with Sarapatel and chorizo in the context of contemporary Brazilian cooking have found in them the same thing that serious engagement with any genuinely old culinary tradition tends to find: a complexity and a depth that rewards attention, that reveals more the more carefully it is examined, that cannot be simplified without losing something essential. The flavor of a properly made Sarapatel is not a simple flavor. It is layered in the way that things made from multiple ingredients that have cooked together for hours are layered. The distinct flavors of the individual components no longer separable, dissolved into something that is the product of all of them together and could not have been produced by any smaller number of them. The mineral depth of the blood, the richness of the rendered fat, the specific contributions of each organ, the balance achieved by the acidic element and the aromatics. These things combine into a flavor that is unlike anything else in the Brazilian culinary tradition, and that can only be understood by tasting it rather than by any description. The people who make Sarapatel today, who still make it in the traditional way from a pig slaughtered on the property, with the blood collected at the moment of slaughter and handled with the specific knowledge that the tradition requires, are fewer than they were a generation ago. The consolidation of food production, the movement of rural populations to cities, the availability of industrial pork products that eliminate the need for the household pig slaughter that was the origin of the dish. These forces have reduced the number of people who maintain the tradition in its complete form. What persists in most urban and many rural contexts is a version of the dish that uses blood and organs purchased from butchers rather than collected at slaughter. A version that is still recognizably Sarapatel, that still produces the characteristic flavor, but that has lost the specific knowledge of the slaughter itself, the immediate handling of the fresh blood, the direct connection between the live animal and the dish that begins within minutes of the slaughter. What has not been lost? What persists in the families and communities where the dish remains a living tradition rather than a museum piece is the understanding of what the dish means. It means the complete use of something that was given. It means the refusal to waste what can feed. It means the application of skill and knowledge to ingredients that have no value to anyone who does not know what to do with them, converting them into something that has not just nutritional value but cultural value. The value of a tradition that has been maintained across generations by people who understood, even when they did not have the language to articulate it in theoretical terms. That the way you handle your food is one of the most fundamental expressions of who you are and where you come from. The blood that was never supposed to leave the slaughterhouse. That was the waste product, the thing to be discarded, the byproduct of the process that produced the cuts of meat that went to the people with the power to choose what they ate. Became, in the hands of the people who were given no choice, something more interesting and more lasting than any of the cuts it was separated from. It became a dish that has outlasted the conditions of scarcity that produced it, that has traveled from the farmyard to the restaurant, from the senzala to the celebration table, from the category of necessity to the category of identity. It became, in other words, exactly what food becomes when the people making it bring to it everything they know and everything they are. Something that carries the full weight of its own history and that feeds not just the body, but the memory of everyone who has ever eaten it and understood where it came from.